Hey, we're talking faith and science, and welcome to the Talkin Faith and Science podcast. My name is Tyler Bullets, and I'm looking forward to joining you on this conversational podcast where we go through and talk to people of science background and talk about their faith. How does faith and science work together for the people who are on the ground dealing with this on a day in, day out basis? It's a conversation that personally for me, I don't feel we hear about nearly enough. So thus, this is where we're at. And this week, we have an amazing person to be able to listen to and talk with, and that is Dr. Dorothy Boorse. She is a professor of biology at Gordon College, where she initially, as an undergrad, got her biology degree, then has a master's degree in entomology from Cornell University, and has her PhD in oceanography and limnology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was able to meet with her and had an amazing conversation as we talked about how does God work within the sciences.
I'm Dorothy Boorse. I grew up in Pennsylvania in a rural township northwest of Philadelphia, and that area is now sort of turned into development. So a lot of the farmland is gone, and so that's changed a lot, and we'll probably talk about some of that later. But anyway, I went to Mennonite schools, and then I went to Gordon College, where I'm now on faculty. But I was gone for after I did my degree in biology, and I got to do two, in particular, wonderful things there. One was to be an intern with the Audubon Society in a project they were doing in salt marshes. And it was a more complicated experiment that they were doing, but I got to map vegetation, and I also got to identify insects. And that's when I fell in love with insects and marshes. So I did some other stuff, and then I went to Cornell and got a degree in entomology. That project was in greenhouses, and married my husband in church there, and we moved to Wisconsin, where I got my PhD in oceanography and limnology. That was back out in wetlands. So my specialty is small wetlands that dry. I worked in the prairie pothole region, which is out where you are, and actually, I don't know where you are, right? Out where you were talking about. And then I moved back, and I've been on faculty at Gordon I'm in my year 26.
Wow.
So I know. So this is a whole career of these fun things. I always say I love biology, love the natural world, love students, and I love God. So being at a small Christian liberal arts college is fantastic. I get to put all that together. And yeah, so let's start. I guess that's enough for now.
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning a little bit then. When you grew up in rural Pennsylvania, so how do you see that forming you? Because I know for me, I grew up in rural western Wisconsin, and that was a major part of developing who I am today, especially how I see God, how I see faith, but also how I understand science, and got me interested in the fields initially. So I want to hear how did that influence you?
Okay, so it's even more than just that setting, because my father and mother were both teachers in Christian schools, and my dad was a science teacher in biology, and my mom did social studies in English, and so they placed a high value on education, and then we had a very old farmhouse. It was all in disrepair. But anyway, we were growing up on this 5-acre farmette, and we had a huge garden, and we had sheep at one point, and rabbits, and dogs and cats and a menagerie. So I had this deep sense of love of land, of everything alive, and was outdoors a lot. And and then my dad was very curious about the world and always teaching in any chance he had. And so we were just constantly faced with all these wonderful things in the world. And I also always had a really a heart for people in vulnerable situations. And our family would pray. We were a Christian family. Both of my parents had some seminary education. My dad was also, while he was a science teacher, he was also ordained. So, so I'll tell you a funny part about that was that he would teach these students in high school. Years later, they'd come back and they'd want him to marry them. And so I went to more weddings than anybody I knew because I was the minister, the science teacher's daughter who married them. But anyway, that's all to say, I never experienced a rift between science and faith inside my own family. But I was faced with it very early in churches. And because I was in Christian education, I didn't deal a lot with secular people looking down on Christianity or something. It was mostly Christians looking down on science that I faced. And I've had both experiences now, but I will say that maybe because I'm a Christian school and I'm serving the church, trying to make this work, I'm serving my guild in the sciences as well, but trying to figure out how scientific community can partner with faith-based organizations and communities in order to achieve things like ecological restoration and that kind of thing. But in any case, I always loved the natural world very much. And then I have a particular fondness for the Mennonite background that I had. We didn't attend a Mennonite church, but the schools that I went to were very, very formative for me. And there just never was a difference between caring about the environment and loving God. For example, they had a huge emphasis on living simply and caring for the natural world as a part of loving your neighbor and bearing witness to Christ to the world. And so my experiences with that being a rift came later. I definitely had a lot of experiences with Christians who did not accept many ideas of mainstream science, and not as much in those schools, but in a variety of churches that I've attended. And for me, I think that God created everything and created the natural world and the laws of nature that it follows. And I don't really separate in my own mind, here's something that humans can understand and we can use the tools of science to study it, and then here's where God acts. I think God acts in everything. God sustains and upholds and created everything. So even if it's understandable, God is in it, right? So I push back on the idea that you look for God in the parts you cannot explain. I think God is Anyway, that's all to say.
It's like recognizing God instead of saying, "Oh, I can't explain it, so it must be God." It's more, no, God's been here the whole time. Why? That's that's kind of how that's how I see things. It's one of the things where I guess I at times have frustration is the aspect of how we like talking about God from a human perspective. And if we're going to specifically look into like the beginnings of Genesis, and it's going through the creation story, and we're very familiar with this, but I think it's overlooks God did all this creating before us. And
Mhm.
it's not like then God said, okay, I'm going to create this in my image, and and this is exact replica of me, and you can ignore all this other stuff I've created. To me, and that's where for me, one of the things the more I've thought about this, talked about this, it's more understanding more parts of the character of God is by us going out and exploring it. And, I've heard from a few different well-trusted people, explains the how, it doesn't explain the why. And that's where I think when you start bringing the faith and science together, that's when you can start getting the complete picture, because they're kind of answering different questions, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. I do sort of couch it in that type of thought myself. I think it's worth saying that because sometimes people think that when you're a Christian, the science is your job is to try and find some mysterious thing no one can explain, and there that God is upheld. And I just have a completely different take on it. I don't think you can use the tools of science to study things that cannot be explained. You can't use them to study miracles or so but I don't think that that's where that you look for God only in the gaps of things that we cannot understand. That is a way that people come to conclude that you shouldn't study science, right? Because science then would be whittling down constantly on the size of God. But in fact, that's not reality at all. It's a great privilege to be able to study the world that God created. It's a great privilege to get to understand a little bit more of it. It's like a deep fractal pattern. There's always layers and layers to study, and I think that's very exciting. And in my field, in ecology, that study leads us to recognize that human actions have been very detrimental to a lot of the rest of creation. And so part of our privilege is also to try and figure out how to stop that and to correct some of those things.
Yeah, I know one of the ways that I've kind of explained kind of like what we've been doing with ecology is kind of like the old game Plinko sticks, where you had the marbles and the sticks are holding up, and the goal is to see if you can pull up the stick without how many marbles fall down. And I
Right.
think, and that's where I don't think with our separation that sometimes we create between creation as a whole and not including ourselves in that and us, it's then this weird game of Plinko sticks of, okay, what can you, one, remove and not notice? Or what do you remove and you start realizing, but is it really that big of a deal? And then it's the question of, well, then how many marbles are going to drop? And at what point does the marbles drop and now suddenly you can't do anything about it anymore?
So, a couple of things that might be worth knowing about for your listeners. One is the concept of planetary boundaries. And that came out in a 2009 paper by a group of scientists, mostly in Europe. But they tried to identify big processes on the globe that have to work for humanity to survive, like having renewable fresh water and clean air and getting the climate to stop it getting warmer, those kinds of things. And then they tried to estimate two things. One is how much humans have changed it, and the other is how much we can change it and still survive, right? And if you look up planetary boundaries, there's these great graphs, and they've done updates ever since then. But that's one way to think about human action and the reasons for protecting. Like there is a self-centered set of reasons to care about the environment too. And so if I was to ask, I'm going to ask you a question and see what you think. Okay, so if I took all of the terrestrial mammals in the world, so not whales, they're not terrestrial, but all the terrestrial mammals, and I weighed them, what percent of that weight would be wild, do you think? Everything else is human bodies and the bodies of domesticated animals.
That's a wow. That's okay. Let me counter. Let me ask one question. And so, like, if I'm planting a, well, no, that's not a. I was thinking trees. No, we're thinking mammals here.
Mammals, yeah. What percent are
It,
wild?
what percentage are wild? It's it's got to be above 50% for sure. And I would guess
Are
somewhere,
wild? Are wild. Okay.
yeah, it has to be at least.
You ready?
Yeah.
4%. 96% of mammal is human bodies and the bodies of domestic animals.
That's crazy.
It is, that one statistic represents many,
Mm-hmm.
but it represents the scale of human activity on Earth. And they're just, it's hard to get your head around how big things are on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard when you look at a mountain, you just think, there's no way humans could affect a mountain. You look at the ocean, you look at the atmosphere, how could we possibly make a difference? But the scale of human impact is really hard to get your head around. And that is just one of many types of statistics that help you picture, oh wow, we dominate on a level that is unprecedented in Earth's history, but also in a way that we've in the past said, well, nature needs to compromise a little. We can compromise a little. Now we're sort of at the point where, like, what percent of wild do you think there ought to be? 2%. Like when do we stop, right? And I feel like we've sort of multiplied and conquered, and now we need to sort of live with everything else and maybe dial it back a little bit, right? So, but that's a sobering statistic.
Well, and I remember back when I was in college too, going through like animal behavior. And one of the things I distinctly remember talking about was like zoos, the ethics behind that, where you're taking some out of some type of wild population at some point to bring them in, and the aspect of what's the cost if you don't, it's hard potentially on that individual. They'll probably have a longer life, but it's taking them out of community to be able to help a whole nother population, communities of people appreciate and care about the broader population. to
Yeah.
so that hopefully the population can survive. And when you start thinking about it that way, it's a little weird, it's a little messed up. It makes sense, but it's just kind of sad that we have to do it that way.
So there's another whole level we can add to that about zoos and just say that zoos right now are the centers for conservation breeding, for wild breeding, for many, many organisms. And sometimes they're the last stage to try and protect something from completely going extinct. So I don't know if you follow any of this, but there's a fungus that has just run rampant around the world and killed a lot of amphibians and caused actual many extinctions. And there's some frog populations that they've captured all the frogs they could and kept them because they could keep them from getting this fungus. The frogs have been the fungus. It was unfortunately spread by humans around the world, and and climate change has made it worse. So the animals are stressed by the climate change, and then the fungus is killing them off. So there are populations of various, especially Latin American frogs, that are only in captivity. But that was to protect them from, and they're trying to breed in some resistance to the fungus or something, trying to get something to work there so that they could eventually, hopefully, be back out in the wild. But yeah, we're sort of on this trying to keep it all together while we figure out how to live a little bit better, a little more lightly on the earth.
Well, and I think a week and a half ago I was down in Baraboo, Wisconsin. And
Yes, Baraboo at the International Crane Foundation.
yes,
Oh
exactly.
my
It had
gosh.
been years since I gotten down there, but just yeah, that how they've been monumental for being able to help crane populations, especially whooping cranes, and being able to
Yep,
hopefully
yep,
slowly bringing back that traditional route from Wisconsin area down to Florida to bring that
yep,
back,
yep.
and slowly bringing awareness to it. And you look at like their work and what they've done helps bring awareness to where now you have in that area, you have Ely, Minnesota with the International Wolf Foundation. You have Houston, Minnesota has the International Owl Center. You have the National Eagle Center down in Wabasha, Minnesota. So, I
I
mean, there's
didn't even know all this. That's fantastic.
there is a lot of that. But then, even while I was down there, I did some biking on the Elroy Sparta Trail
Hmm.
and going through there's 3 tunnels down there. Well, what are they doing? They're closing those up in the winter for bats to hibernate down in the tunnels. But then they're also, as you're entering those tunnels, they're talking about, okay, whatever you're wearing in here, you don't want to be bringing to another cave because of white nose syndrome.
Right,
And having done some bat research in my past, it's
right.
crazy how that just wipes the
Did.
floor.
And in fact, just today I was reading another article that said there's a new strain of white nose fungus that is even worse. So I do think that we've set a premium on making the most amount of money as we can out of our effort and our financial investments, and now we really need to be thinking our goal is to protect as much as we can and to support human flourishing with which if we were to do things differently we could. But anyway, I yeah, I about Baraboo. Oh my God, I have dear friends out there. And when I was doing my PhD, I worked on 2 wetlands that they have, Stedman and Brommy. Um, I think were the names of them, but I was doing work on vernal pools there. But I have very fond memories of the International Crane Foundation. That's
Well, I grew up a half an hour from Crex Meadows, if you know where that is, up in northwestern Wisconsin.
okay.
That's it's a major, well, it's become a major flyway, especially for sandhills. And then if I'm remembering the history correctly off the top of my head, 20s, they had a carpet company come in and drain the marshes. Been bankrupt in the 30s, and they found that that was a problem, and have had dikes put in to reflood. And
Was it like
it's
Horicon Marsh?
kind of like Horicon, but on the other side.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay. So I'm familiar with Horicon Marsh, and oh my gosh, that story, same way, just a lot of poor planning,
Well,
not,
and
not
it gets
thinking.
back to being an ecologist.
Hmm.
The hard thing, I remember when I was sitting in my ecology classes, I was raised by more of an ecologist, biologist in high school.
Hmm.
And that, you're dealing with concepts, which then a lot of medical students seem to struggle with, the idea of we can only get to concepts. We can't necessarily get to super particular because every ecosystem is slightly different. There's a lot of different population variances and things like that that's going to modify how each ecosystem is going to function as you move across. But also just thinking about these things in broader senses and realizing something that you do now is going to affect things for decades, and it might take decades to see the results of what you're doing.
Hmm.
And especially in a society that's moving faster and faster and faster, it's counterintuitive to say we're going to do something we may not see results for 20 years.
So I do think that there's precedent in Christianity going back, to early Christians, to be thinking not just about the future in terms of eternity, but thinking about your children and grandchildren and the land that you live on. I think people did care about fields, and in the Bible, there's a lot of letting land lie fallow and taking care of fruit trees, even in wartime, and all these things. I I think we somehow lost our way in there with the Industrial Revolution and following, where we got this hubris that we're going to be able to overcome everything technologically and just grow indefinitely without any thinking about it. And God allows us to bear the natural consequences of our actions most of the time. I mean, and so I think that that's what we're in for right now. I'm hoping really that the church can be more of a leader than the American Christian church has been. I think there's been a lot of not wanting to believe that we made poor choices in the past, or that our way of life is not sustainable. And and sometimes because that message is coming from scientists, there have been people that haven't wanted to listen to it. But worldwide, our brothers and sisters in Christ are very concerned about climate change, very concerned about a lot of environmental things. And the World Evangelical Alliance has a whole sustainability center. And so I think connecting anything that we can to what people, our brothers and sisters, are saying in other countries is really helpful.
Here, I have a question then for you to bounce one back. So if I'm remembering correctly, the first two things that God tells Adam to do. First, one of them is to go and be fruitful and multiply, and we know how to do that well. What was the
Mhm.
other one?
To name the animals,
And
name everything.
and that's where one of the things that I think, and I've talked about, I know plenty, but I think it's so important, and it's so important, I think, for my theology that I have, is why would God do that? How many artists do we know that go and create a painting, go and take a portrait, go and do something like this, and then go and ask somebody else to name it.
Mm.
That's very uncommon. That's very unusual. Why would you do that? The reason you would do that is once you've named something, it becomes important. You know, you were talking about like the fruit trees during wartime, and well, if you ask those people, a lot of times there's probably some type of family connection to the land, to the tree, to whatever, and that it transcends whatever is going on, that I need to make sure that I take care of that. You know, and the phrase I like using, a dog is a dog until it's Fido, and then you fight for Fido. Because, and I think that's the intention on why God wanted us to name the creation. God wanted us to have this deeper, intimate connection with it. And I think part of what we have completely missed the boat on is if we aren't connecting with that, we're missing a connection of who God is. And so we're missing whole facets of who God is. And if that's who we're trying to understand, why are we ignoring this part of God?
I think another way to connect that with the be fruitful and multiply, though, idea is that God gave that command to everything, not just humans. And so we are not to be fruitful and multiply at the expense of other creatures' fruitfulness. And that's right now, that is what's happening. What we're doing comes at the expense of everything else being fruitful. And I think that that's not a good thing. But I also completely agree that the naming in the Bible, names matter all the time. Like people's names are changed as a result of a new task or relationship with God. And people name places where things happen, and they name things. And I feel like that Genesis naming is just the beginning of the long set of naming as a way of marking something as important, like you said.
Well, and I think that's where also, you know, in Genesis 1, where we have the word dominion in many translations. And I think, yes, I think there's different ways you can interpret dominion. If I have a raised bed, sure, I have dominion over that raised bed. But I have plants in the ground. I'm still wanting them to thrive. I'm trying to make sure that they produce fruit so that I have something at harvest time. But it's also thinking about, okay, what plants work well by each other? What things do I need to make sure is in the soil for them to be able to? If they're not as successful as I'd hoped, it's not that I blame the plants per se. It's that, okay, what did I do wrong? What should I have done differently to give them better chances at success? And I think we think about that with people, but we don't extend that to creation. And I think it's very limiting in a lot of ways to who God can be then.
One thing I will say that my thinking is a little different as an ecologist is that many Christians really divide the natural world up into things that they like and things they don't like. And everything they don't like, they think somehow is associated with being in the fall. And I'm just here to say, nope. It's sort of like, just like you have to have, if you're going to have daytime, you got to have nighttime. Just like you're going to have, plants, you're going to have things that live on plants. And if you're going to have things that live on plants, you're going to have things that live on them. And God did create a world with nutrient cycles and rules about how energy flows. And there's a lot of things that God created and rejoices in and is proud of that could be dangerous or unpleasant for humans. And I will say that that's one place where my science and faith come together in a way that is informed by my science, and that I am not always in agreement with other Christians. And I don't personally believe that it's our job to try and make our lives on earth as physically pleasant as possible. I don't mean encouraging pain, but I do mean like we live in houses that are now completely climate controlled, right? And actually, I don't know if you know this, but people's basal metabolisms are dropping so that people are gaining weight more easily, in part because of that. So, we made this world that we're trying to eliminate all difficulties, and it's not good for everything else, but it's not particularly good, always good for us either.
Well, it's like allergies. When you look at what is allergies, it's the body attacking itself in a certain way, finding something to do that. And a lot of the research is showing that it's based on, because there isn't anything to fight, they choose something that, okay, let's practice on this.
Well, I do know that kids raised on farms have fewer allergies. Yeah.
They're
And
exposed
around.
to more.
Mhm. Yeah.
How has your research, your career, where has those types of intersections of faith and just science and the stuff that you've been working on, where has that kind of met and happened for you?
Okay. So I think there's a lot of potential answers to that. And one is in my teaching, because I teach young people at a small Christian college, and many of them are really struggling with how do I put science and faith together. And I and my colleagues are very intentional in trying to illustrate different ways that that could happen, not tell them exactly how to think about everything, but to illustrate different possible ways of putting things together, and to invite them onto a journey of learning that, and to show that it don't have to choose between science and faith. So that's a really important part of what I do. And some of the rest of what I do is in talking to other people who are not my students but are in the church, trying to lessen that sense of conflict between science and faith. And I do see that as a way of serving the church. I think also that being in a secular guild is a way that Christians are living out Christ in public, and trying to heal rifts and build bridges. And those, and so I try to be a real connector. I think that in my own work, there's just so much joy in seeing the profound beauty of the natural world. I've just had these transcendent experiences, mostly in wetlands, but also looking at the eyes of insects, which are just so cool. It's amazing. And rocks and just all sorts of stuff. God, the variety of things is amazing out there. So it's really quite a joy to get to study the created world and to learn. I love to learn. And then to be able to share the wonder of that. I think there's a lot of people that really love the outdoors when they're kids and then sort of lose that. And so sometimes I'll just take people ponding, they're capturing things and looking at them. And the parents are like, "Oh wow, I'd forgotten how fun this is," and the kids are like, "Oh, I always knew." So, with the entomology and oceanography and limnology, all in my background, I always say I'm a hit with the under 10 crowd because I know about bugs and frogs, which I do actually. So that's a lot of fun. I think I have a network of a sort of a distributed network of colleagues across the US at different schools who are in similar situations to me inside the church and in Christian colleges and trying to talk about the environment and science. And I think that's been a real joy to me to be sort of trying to form a community that then is helpful to the next generation of scientists. I think there's a joy in being useful. And so I feel like I've had some real opportunities to serve God and the body of Christ. And I initially thought I was going to be a medical missionary, and that was back when I thought, that's what you did if you loved biology and people and God. That was what you did. And I've gotten to do that and look at frogs and bugs. So that's been pretty exciting for me.
So where for you do you feel closest to God?
Oh, you know what? I can't just pick one place, but I will say that I do love wetlands a lot. I feel like God created these little cathedrals and then we forgot that's what they were. There and sometimes when you love something, it's not that every single part of it is what you would prefer. It's just the whole package. So wetlands have a smell to them that not everybody likes. But to me, they just bring back so many memories. So even a sulfur smell like rotten eggs will be like, send me into nostalgia for some wetland I was in. But
I know, like when I worked with the Minnesota DNR for a summer. And so I did some bat research, but one of the other things we did, we worked up in the Saxim Bog, if you know where that is. And we were doing small mammal diversity inventory, basically. And yes, trudging through those bogs slowly, setting trap lines, looking at what we get, come back the next day. And I would agree with you. It's one of those things when you really start getting to those places where you can set like Sherman traps and see what's there, or doing population curves and being able to see the interactions and how different species interact with each other. That's when you start seeing like what I would say is the fabric of what this place has been built on. And it's for us to slowly understand that we get to be a privilege to be part of it for a period of time. And what are you going to do with that time? And then being the ecologist that you are, you start realizing that it's not just this marsh, it's not just this bog, it's not just this stream. It's now we have ecosystems at multiple levels. We have, depending on where you're at, up, down, left, right. Are we in a prairie? Are we in a forest? What part of the forest? And just studying that and seeing the connectiveness and how vital so many of these different things are. And then how many of them are like your keystone species are the species that you wouldn't expect that are suddenly the ones who are so important for the ecosystem to function.
Like beavers.
Like beaver. Or did you see earlier this year how beavers, it was somewhere over in Europe, they've been planning for 7 years to put in this dam, multi-million-dollar dam they're going to put in, taking 7 years of planning. They did it in 2 days. The exact location where they just happened to build it, and they saved the country like $2 billion or something. And it was like,
I missed
Boom.
that. I'll have to look that
I'll have to
up.
find that one and put that in there. It was just like, you know, there's an aspect of, and that's where for me, there's an aspect of you feel like God's interacting within the creation in and of itself. Does God not see some of this stuff going on as well? See, okay, it's time. They're just about done. Let's have the beavers do it for 2 days and take care of the problem for them. Let's see if they learn. You know,
That's really funny.
oh yeah, I'll have to find that article and send it over. I mean, it's just it's comical, and the thing is it's, you know, more and more when you go and look for that stuff, it's there where nature continues to show and overcome and do these things. And it's like, at what point do we realize that, give credence to that, and somewhat plan for that? I think is
Right.
something that's lacking in our society.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the way modern America thinks is very different from the way ecology works. And Aldo Leopold wrote an essay, Thinking Like a Mountain. Do you know that one?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's sort of illustrates his realizing that predators are important. And he had been, in one of those killing all the wolves and coyotes and mountain lions sort of bounty hunting mentalities until he realized as an ecologist. And same with fire. He was also one that realized that fires are important for prairies and savannas. And it took him, he was on a journey and it took him a while to realize that, but we don't really tend to think like ecosystems do. And around here, in Massachusetts, it's barrier islands and coastal zones are constantly in flux. It's things like beaver used to be a huge shaper of the landscape. Then they were almost entirely extirpated, and then they bounced back, but nowhere to near what they would have been. But that's partially because we bought plots of land and we have this idea that land should be exactly the way it was when I bought it. Like we're not adaptable to the flux of change.
Well, I
In,
love that you brought up Thinking Like a Mountain. That's an amazing short
yeah,
part by Aldo Leopold, because he basically was 60 years ahead
right,
of what happened at Yellowstone.
right,
You
right.
reintroduce the
Mhm.
wolves, it totally redoes their whole ecosystem, and the,
In good
you know,
ways.
in good
Yeah.
ways, yes, the erosion, the all the issues that they were noticing, and it's not like they disappeared overnight, but you could see improvement
Improvement. Hmm.
moving, and they weren't doing anything different. You know, and you know,
Hmm.
thinking of that Northeast, have you ever read the book The Secret Life of Lobsters?
No, well, I have to do that.
That was one I had to read in my undergrad.
Oh my gosh.
But it was going through how the federal government tried putting sizing on the lobster industry on how big. And I want to say
Hmm.
it was in like the late 70s, something like
Right.
that. And the lobstermen were pushed back saying, we're basically already doing that. And that was with the notching of the tails of the females. And the book goes through kind of some interactions both back and forth of that, but also then kind of talking about the life cycle of lobsters. And one of the big
Mhm.
things that they were, you know, as they were studying this and looking at this, there's a short period of time where the lobsters are real tiny, where they can swim backwards. It's the one time in their life they can. But they were trying to figure out why have this adaptation?
Mm.
And that's where then they started looking into, well, there's one thing that's missing in this ecosystem, and that's cod. The cod isn't near at the levels that it would have been.
Right.
And so
Right.
suddenly you put that into the equation, and they did some different tests, and oh, by golly, yes, this was an adaptation for the cod to make
Oh,
sure that they could
interesting.
avoid some of the
Oh,
cod.
God. Huh.
And so
Yes,
now, and then you get something
basically.
like that. That's so weird. Like, why are you able to do that for a couple months of your life?
Right. Well, we did collapse the cod fishery here. I mean, I say we, I wasn't part of that, but um, as humans, we did. And and up in Newfoundland before it happened off the New England coast, and it has not recovered anywhere near what we would have hoped. So I still hope, but we've got to do better than we're doing. I think climate change is probably the biggest thing that I think I want fellow Christians to understand. Like, scientists are not making this up. This is a real thing and needs our attention. And I will say that with my own students, most of them are completely convinced that climate change is real. They're daunted by it, right? They need help thinking, how can I be a part of the solution? Um, and I don't know how that conversation is going out in Minnesota, but up and down, I'm sure.
Yeah, up and down. Having worked in the solar industry at different points. Well, and that's where I think of. I'm watching my words carefully on this. I watch also like how churches interact with that at times too,
Very much.
because
Mhm.
yes, I think it can be an amazing statement to look at that we're caring for the environment. But it's also, I would argue, it's not necessarily the right statement if you're purely looking at it for the financial rebates and different things of that nature. You still have to make sure that you're building a sustainable house to be able to house that, if that makes sense. And I think that's where at times, yes, the at different points where we've had different financial incentives statewide or nationally are very important, but there's also, I would argue, certain ways that they should be pursued correctly. Otherwise, you can set yourself up for some interesting situations. One of the things, like I live in Minnesota, but I grew up in Wisconsin. One of the things that's amazing, because I grew up 10 minutes from the border,
Right.
the the policy differences there are vastly different.
Mm-hmm.
And Wisconsin was purposely trying to make it where, okay, we'll have your rates real low, but your hookup fee will be really expensive, disincentivizing renewable energy. And on top of that, how their incentive program works is, okay, so if you're getting charged 12 cents per kilowatt hour, let's just say, if you're overproducing, you are selling it back to the electric company at the rate that they would be buying it at. So if they're buying it at 3 cents, but they're selling it at 12,
Mm.
then you're trying to match systems to what you're currently consuming, not necessarily forward thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas Minnesota, within reason, there's limits to it, but they say no. If they're buying it at this rate, if they're overproducing, they're selling it back to you at that rate. At least when I was doing that 10 years ago, and I'm fairly confident that's still the law. So here you have, again, we make,
Mm-hmm.
as humans, arbitrary lines
Mm-hmm.
suddenly saying, and it's a vastly different way of
Right.
thinking about it and how you're going to approach that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, you're getting into some of the political and the
The
policy
policy, yeah.
trying to support an idea that lots of people might agree with, but how it actually plays itself out is beyond the science. I mean, that's one of the things about climate change is scientists have said their piece and they'll continue to say it, but it's really not about the science now. It's really about what are we going to do with that information?
So let's do a shift here.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see the hope in all of this? Where do you see the hope and the joy, we'll put it that way, the hope and the joy that science and faith can provide. And where does that fit within our modern church infrastructure, but even within just our own personal faith growth? Where does that fit?
Well, I think my answers would be really similar to your question about where do you see God. Um, I think there is a profound beauty in the world as much as it is hurt by our actions. It's still very beautiful, and I think there's hope in seeing that. I think there's hope in teaching because young people are the next wave of workers trying to do God's work, whatever that is. I think there's hope in particular that that you have this podcast, right? That isn't something that was true 30 years ago. There weren't podcasts did not exist, and there weren't any on science and faith, and there certainly weren't any talking about climate change. So, I mean, just in that, the world has changed a lot, and the fact that we're having this conversation is a good change. I do tell my students that the, environmentally, the world is not as good, as well off now as when I was an undergrad, but it's not as lonely to care about it as it was. It felt like you were saying things and it just went nowhere. And now there's a lot of people sort of scrambling around saying, I'm not sure what to do. And then there's other people saying, hey, we're over here. We've got some ideas. I think we're going to do a lot more shouting and running around in circles. However, I think that we are at a better place in terms of people wanting to make change. Not everybody. The people for whom the fossil fuel oriented industrial revolution worked do not want change. But a lot of people do. And I think people are starting to make that connection a little bit better to caring for people in poverty and caring for the environment in more concrete ways. And I think that's incredibly important. People are making a connection between we can't carry the gospel, we can't do the mission of the church if we are irrelevant and if we don't care about the living situations of the people that we're trying to serve. So I do think that there's a lot of hope in that. And then people are inventing things. These are not problems for which there's a techno fix, but technology will be part of the tools. And every time I read about a new battery that's like 50% better than the last one, I think, yay, that's a win for the team, right? So you have to celebrate all the wins.
I agree. I think also it's realizing the little things that you can do that do make a small difference. And maybe it doesn't feel like it's a big difference on the grand scale, but you do something and it's a start, and that's progress. And for me, one of the big ones, I'm kind of seeing it right over there. We planted a native garden, a small native garden by our house. And so this year, one of the big things has been, one, seeing what survived the winter. There's a few things that didn't make it. Okay, cool. One of the big tasks now will be going through and figuring out, okay, what's do we want here and what's weed, having to do some more identification, and they'll be good learning some of that stuff. But it's also, for me, it's been so life-giving just seeing, this is stuff that's resilient. This is stuff that's it's used to this stuff. It can make it. I just have to do some care to it. Like I was instructed to do way back in Genesis, take care of this place. And I think that's, you talked about Cornell, and I had to hold myself back because I've done plenty of bird counts with the Christmas bird
Mm-hmm.
count and stuff like that. I'm fundamental for partially parts of who I am. But, you know, I remember talking to my biology mentor, I would say at minimum, and talking to him because he'd do summer counts in Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
He could list off 8 years ago. Yeah, I could give you a list of about half a dozen or a dozen birds that I'm not seeing when I'm going out and doing counts for the Wisconsin DNR.
Right.
It's like they've just disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And what is, as the ecologist, we don't know necessarily always what the fallout will be, and it's not necessarily always right away. And that's the hard thing with it.
It is. And you asked about hope. There is a time for lament, and I certainly do that too. But I know that for my students, it's easier for them to see the problem than it is to see solutions. And so I'm pretty committed to trying to find those solutions, just because they're living with this world, right? Um, and but but anyway, yeah. So well,
Well,
thank.
yeah, the more of us who can work together, the easier the problems get. We have more ideas.
And I think that being in community, I always tell my students to join a group that's doing something. Don't feel like you have to just do it on your own. And the other thing is to vote and to prioritize creation care when you're voting. I I I don't think we have a lot of great options right now, and um, and yet we'll have to make those options, right? But um, I'm not ever going to be a professional politician, but I can vote, right? So that's one tool I've got.
And it's a privilege that we have been given in this part of the world to be able to do
Right.
that. And I think that's
Right.
one thing that's easy for us to overlook. So, is there anything you want to shout out or any resources you want to plug here at the end?
Well, thank you for asking that. I would just say one group that I think is doing great work is called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. So, okay, I'll call out a couple. Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, just because if you've got young listeners and they're thinking, help, I got nothing, I don't know what I'm doing, they're offshoot of the Evangelical Environmental Network. So that's a shout out. I would highlight AROSHA, which is international and is a conservation organization. And I'd highlight an organization that I have connection to with Ensemble Institute, which is Institute of Environmental Studies. It teaches college classes. So if you've got a young demographic listening, they might be interested in one of those.
It's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the time
Yeah,
today. It's just been a lot of fun. I've really
you
enjoyed my
too.
time.
You too. Okay, thank you. It
Yeah.
was nice to meet you.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully we can connect some other time at some point. So, how about that conversation? We went through a lot of ground and covered a lot of different territory. But I think it reminds us again how vast God really is. There's a lot of things that we underestimate, and especially we as humans like putting God into this little box. And especially as we kind of talked about how often we look at God from a human side of things instead of really contemplating and considering what is the full scope of what God is doing, especially when we start thinking about God's creation. Wasn't it mind boggling thinking about how little of God's creation of true mammals are wild still? I think that's an aspect for us to be considering and thinking about. And how does that work within our understanding of thinking about caring about creation? How does that influence how we think about the God that we serve and trying to understand God, the creator that we have? I think a lot of these types of questions are super important for us to contemplate and consider as we continue to work on and grow in our faith. And I want to thank again Dr. Boorse for coming on and joining us and giving these thought-provoking things to consider and to think about and to grow with as we had an amazing conversation. And I know for me, having conversations like this helps me be able to grow in my faith. But I really want to hear from you. What were your thoughts from this initial conversation? Was there things that I can work on and grow with? Was there certain types of questions you wish I would have asked? Feel free to shoot that down in the comments section or shoot me an email. Links for that will be down in the show notes. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.